Coffee stained the cuff of Maeve's polyester uniform, a stark brown ring against cheap white fabric. She smelled of old fry grease and bleach, counting down the minutes until her graveyard shift ended. Then she saw the red wire trailing beneath the black Lincoln Town car idling in the alley. A wire that strictly did not belong. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up with the sheer, suicidal stupidity of running into the rain toward the city's most dangerous man. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sickly green-tinged hue over the cracked linoleum floor of the diner. Maeve dragged a damp rag across the laminate counter, pushing a pile of crumbs into her waiting palm. Her lower back throbbed. 10 hours into a 12-hour shift, her body was a symphony of dull aches entirely concentrated in the arches of her feet and the base of her neck. Rain lashed against the large front window, blurring the neon "open" sign into a smeared red streak against the black night. The diner smelled intensely of stale coffee, burnt onions, and the heavy ammonia scent of the floor cleaner she had used an hour ago. Footsteps sounded against the tile. Steady, heavy, expensive. Roman Rossi did not look like a man who ate at greasy spoons. His wool overcoat was damp at the shoulders, cut perfectly to his broad frame, hiding the bulk of whatever hardware he carried beneath his ribs. Maeve knew who he was. Everyone in this crumbling district of the city knew the Rossi family. You didn't stare at them. You didn't cross them. You poured their coffee, looked at the table and forgot their faces the moment they left $100 bill beside their empty cup. "Black coffee," Roman said. His voice was a low rumble, barely carrying over the hum of the ancient refrigerators behind the counter. He didn't look at her. He slid into the corner booth, putting his back to the wall, his eyes immediately tracking the exits. Maeve nodded once. She grabbed the glass pot, the handle warm and sticky with residue, and carried it over. Her hands shook slightly. She hated that they shook. She poured the dark, sludgy liquid into a thick ceramic mug, keeping her eyes fixed on the rim so it wouldn't spill. He smelled like rain ozone and an expensive leather interior. Underneath that, something metallic, like copper, like blood. "Need anything else?" she muttered, her voice raspy from disuse. "No." A single syllable, sharp and final. Maeve retreated to the counter. She watched him through the reflection of the pie case. He didn't drink the coffee. He just held the mug, letting the heat seep into his palms, staring out the rain-streaked window toward the alleyway. Out there, his driver sat in a sleek black Lincoln exhaust, pluming white into the cold air. Bored and exhausted, Maeve took a bottle of Windex and moved toward the front window. She sprayed the glass, the harsh chemical scent biting her nose, and wiped a paper towel in tight, squeaking circles. As she wiped away a layer of condensation, her eyes naturally dropped to the alley. The street lamp flickered, casting long, jumping shadows over the wet asphalt. Water pooled beneath the Lincoln. But in the yellow glow of the streetlight, Maeve saw something else. Tucked behind the rear passenger tire, secured awkwardly to the undercarriage, was a small black box, and dangling from it, dipping just enough to catch the light, was a thin, bright red wire. Blinking, Maeve leaned closer, her nose almost touching the cold glass. Her breath fogged the pain. She rubbed it away violently with her knuckles. It was still there. She wasn't an expert. She was a 26-year-old waitress drowning in medical debt from her mother's failing kidneys. But growing up in this neighborhood, you learned what a car bomb looked like. You learned what kind of grudges required that much C4. Panic sharp and cold spiked in her chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. If that car blew the blast, Radius would take out the alley. It would blow the diner's windows inward, turning the heavy glass pane she was standing behind into 1,000 flying guillotines. Roman slid out of his booth. He threw a folded bill onto the table. He was leaving. He was walking toward the door, buttoning his overcoat. Maeve froze. Common sense screamed at her to dive behind the heavy steel counter. Let him walk out. Let him get into the car. It was his problem. His violent, bloody life catching up to him. He pushed the diner door open. The bell jingled merrily. The roar of the rain flooded the quiet diner. He stepped out into the downpour. He was 10 feet from the car. The driver was reaching over to pop the back door open. Air seized in Maeve's lungs. She dropped the Windex. The plastic bottle hit the linoleum with a dull crack. She ran. Pushing through the heavy glass door, the freezing rain hit her instantly, plastering her thin uniform to her skin. Her cheap, non-slip shoes squeaked desperately against the wet concrete. "Don't get in the car!" she screamed, her voice cracking, tearing out of her throat. Roman paused. He turned his dark eyes, narrowing through the sheets of rain. He looked at her standing there, shivering in the downpour, a frail, soaking wet woman, waving her arms like a lunatic. "Wait!" she yelled again, pointing a trembling finger at the rear tire. "There's a wire under the back." Deafening heat swallowed the world. It didn't happen like in the movies. There was no slow-motion blossom of orange flame, no warning hiss. There was simply a concussive slap of air so hard it felt like a physical blow to the chest, followed by a roar that ripped the sound right out of her ears. Maeve didn't dive gracefully. The shockwave picked her up and threw her backward. She hit the wet asphalt, the air driving from her lungs in a violent rush. Searing heat washed over her face, instantly singeing her eyebrows and eyelashes. Debris rained down in a sharp, chaotic clatter. A chunk of twisted metal slammed into the brick wall above her, showering her with red dust. She lay there gasping like a beached fish, her vision swimming with purple spots. Her ears were emitting a high-pitched, endless scream. Rain hissed as it hit the flaming wreckage of the Lincoln. The smell of burning rubber, vaporized gasoline, and charred meat filled her nose, thick and suffocating. She gagged, tasting copper and ash. Rough hands grabbed her, not gentle, not heroic. Viciously tight fingers clamped onto the fabric of her uniform collar, hauling her upward with enough force to strain her neck. Maeve choked her vision, clearing just enough to see Roman. His face was streaked with black soot, his expensive coat singed at the lapel. A jagged cut leaked blood down his cheek, mixing with the rain. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. They were feral, pure predatory survival. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't thank her for saving his life. Instead, he slammed her against the brick wall of the alleyway. The breath she had just managed to claw back into her lungs vanished again. Cold steel pressed hard into the soft flesh under her jaw. A gun. Maeve stared, paralyzed, her mind fragmented. "I saved him. I just saved him." "Who sent you?" Roman snarled. His voice was a harsh vibration against the ringing in her ears. He was leaning into her, pinning her entirely with his body weight. "Well, what?" She wheezed, her vocal cords raw from her scream. He pressed the barrel harder, forcing her chin up. Water dripped from his nose onto her cheek. "I said, who sent you? How did you know about the rig? Nobody touches my cars without an inside man. So talk, or I leave you in this alley with a hole in your throat." Tears of pure, frustrated terror sprang to her eyes. The sheer injustice of it made her dizzy. "I saw it," she sobbed, her hands coming up to grip his thick, wet wrists. "I was washing the window. I saw the wire, you psychotic bastard." Roman searched her face. His gaze flicked over her blown-out pupils, the dirt smeared across her cheek, the genuine, unadulterated panic radiating off her body in waves. He looked at the burning wreckage. The driver was gone. The flames were licking the brick walls, threatening to catch the diner's awning. Sirens wailed in the distance, a faint rising whine slicing through the heavy rain. He looked back at her. the feral intensity in his eyes dimmed by a fraction, replaced by a cold, calculating machine. He shoved the gun back into his shoulder holster. "Hey!" She started sliding down the brick wall as he released his pinning weight. He grabbed her arm again. This time his grip locked around her wrist like a vice. "You're coming with me," he barked, pulling her forward. "No, I have to my shift. I need to talk to the cops." Roman stopped yanking her back so hard she stumbled into his chest. He grabbed her jaw, his thumb pressing into her cheekbone. "Listen to me, Waitress. Whoever set that bomb is going to be watching the news tonight. When they find out I'm not a smear on the pavement, they're going to want to know how I survived. They will find out about the girl who screamed in the alley. If you stay here, you're dead by morning." Maeve trembled, the cold and the adrenaline finally causing her teeth to chatter audibly. She looked at his dark, unblinking eyes. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was stating a meteorological fact. "Walk," he commanded, letting go of her jaw and pulling her by the wrist. She didn't fight him. Her legs felt like hollow reeds. She let him drag her away from the burning light, stumbling over loose trash and broken pavement, disappearing into the pitch-black labyrinth of the city's alleys, just as the first red and blue lights painted the mouth of the street. Breathing felt like swallowing broken glass. Maeve sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked grey sedan, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She couldn't stop shaking. It was an aggressive, full-body tremor that rattled her teeth and made her muscles ache. The heater was blasting, blowing hot, dry air directly onto her soaked uniform, but she felt frozen from the inside out. Roman sat behind the wheel. He drove with one hand, navigating the slick, rain-swept streets with dangerous speed but zero recklessness. His jaw was set in granite. Blood had dried in a jagged line down his neck, staining his crisp white shirt collar a rusty brown. The silence inside the car was suffocating. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers and the low thrum of the engine. Maeve stared at her hands. They were covered in soot and small superficial scratches from the asphalt. Her fingernails were lined with black dirt. She looked ridiculous. She looked like a garbage bag left out in the rain, sitting next to a man who, despite the explosion and the blood, still looked like he owned the city. Resentment flared in her chest, hot and ugly. She hated him. She hated herself for looking out that window. She should have just wiped the counter. She should have gone into the walk-in freezer to count the frozen patties. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, reedy. Roman didn't look at her. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, checking for a tail. "Safe house. South side." "I have a mother," Maeve blurted out. The thought hit her with the force of a second shockwave. "She's at the apartment. She's sick. If I don't come home tomorrow with her medication, she'll panic. I'll have my people secure her." "Your people?" Maeve let out a harsh, wet bark of laughter. "You think I want your mafia goons showing up at my sick mother's door? You think that's going to calm her down?" Roman finally turned his head. The dashboard lights cast deep shadows under his eyes. "You think the people who tried to blow me into pieces are going to send her a fruit basket to ask where you are? They will torture her to get to you. Then they will kill her." Maeve shut her mouth. Her stomach rolled violently. She clamped a hand over her mouth, tasting bile and ash, squeezing her eyes shut as the reality of his words settled into her bones. She wasn't just unemployed now. She was a target. "Breathe," Roman said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. "In through your nose. Out through your mouth. Don't throw up in my car." She glared at him through watery eyes, but she did it. The oxygen helped quell the nausea slightly. He reached into the center console, keeping his eyes on the road, and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. He tossed it into her lap. "Wipe your face," he said flatly. "You have blood on your forehead." Maeve picked up the square of fabric. It felt ridiculously soft against her calloused fingers. She pressed it to her forehead, wincing as the linen bit into a cut she hadn't realized she had. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Now," Roman said, turning the steering wheel, sharply pulling the sedan into a dark, subterranean parking garage. "We figure out who put the wire under my car, and you stay out of sight until I pull their lungs out through their chest." He parked the car in the darkest corner of the concrete structure. The engine cut off. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. Roman unbuckled his seatbelt. He turned fully to face her. In the gloom, he looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight with pain and stress. He reached out. Maeve flinched backward, pressing her spine into the car door. Roman paused, his hand hovering in the space between them. He slowly lowered it, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't going to hurt you," he said softly, a stark contrast to his earlier roaring commands. "I was going to see how bad the cut was." "It's fine," she snapped, clutching the bloody handkerchief tight in her fist. "Just don't touch me." He studied her for a long moment. He saw the sheer grit holding her together, the way her jaw was clenched tight enough to crack molars, the absolute defiance in eyes that were wide with terror. She wasn't a trained soldier. She was just a waitress who had made a split-second decision to be decent, and it had ruined her life. "Get out," he finally said, opening his door. "We're going up." Maeve hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. She looked out into the dim concrete garage. It felt like a tomb. She looked back at Roman, who was standing outside the car, watching her with dark, unblinking eyes. There was no turning back. The diner was gone. Her quiet, miserable, predictable life was ash on the wet pavement. Swallowing hard, she pulled the handle and stepped out into the cold. Bronze elevator doors slid shut, sealing them inside a humming metal box. Upward they went. Maeve's stomach dropped toward her scuffed, slip-resistant shoes. She leaned against the cold paneling, shivering violently, as the adrenaline finally began to curdle into sheer exhaustion. Roman stood beside her perfectly still. The only evidence he had just survived a car bomb was the dark streak of dried blood cracking on his jawline and the heavy metallic smell radiating off his ruined coat. He didn't pace. He didn't breathe heavily. He watched the digital floor numbers climb with the detached boredom of a man waiting for a bus. "Stop looking at me like I'm going to eat you," he said. His voice echoed slightly in the confined space. Maeve swallowed a dry lump in her throat. "I'm not looking at you. You're staring at my neck." She averted her eyes, focusing instead on the scuff marks on her own cheap shoes. "I'm just trying to process. 10 minutes ago I was wiping down a pie case. Now I'm in a secret elevator with a mobster." "I prefer businessmen," Roman muttered, though there was no humor in it. "Right. Businessmen regularly check their undercarriages for C4. The elevator pinged softly. The doors slid apart, revealing not a dark, gritty hideout, but a vast, sterile penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city's glowing skyline, obscured slightly by the relentless driving rain. The floors were polished dark walnut. Furniture was sparse, low profile, and looked absurdly expensive. The entire place smelled of ozone lemon polish and absolute emptiness. Nobody lived here. It was a holding pen with a view. Roman stepped out, shrugging off his heavy singed overcoat. He let it drop directly onto the pristine floor. "Down the hall, second door on the left," he instructed, walking toward a sleek kitchen island. "Bathroom. Take off that wet uniform before you catch pneumonia. There are clean clothes in the cabinet." Maeve didn't argue. Her polyester dress was plastered to her skin, freezing her to the bone. She walked down the long, shadowed hallway. Her shoes squeaked obscenely loud against the hardwood. The bathroom was a cavern of white marble and glass. Harsh, recessed lighting flicked on automatically. Maeve caught sight of herself in the massive mirror and recoiled. She looked half dead. Her brown hair was matted to her skull, stiff with dried rain and concrete dust. Her face was smeared with black soot, making the whites of her eyes look wide and manic. A jagged, angry cut sliced through her left eyebrow, weeping a slow trail of pink fluid down her temple. Numb fingers fumbled with the plastic buttons of her uniform. She peeled the wet fabric away, tossing it into the corner where it landed with a heavy, wet slap. In the cabinet, just as he said, she found a stack of folded clothes, grey sweatpants, a black, oversized t-shirt. They smelled like unscented laundry detergent and stale air. She pulled them on. They swallowed her small frame, but they were bone dry. When she emerged, Roman was sitting at the kitchen island under a low-hanging pendant light. He had stripped off his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal forearms corded with dense muscle and faded, jagged scars. A leather medical kit sat open on the granite counter. He was holding a cotton pad soaked in rubbing alcohol to the gash on his face. He didn't wince. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the stool across from him. Maeve approached, slowly perched on the edge of the leather seat. Roman tossed a small plastic bottle of peroxide and a clean rag across the smooth granite. It slid and stopped inches from her hand. "Clean your face. You look like a raccoon." She uncapped the bottle. The sharp, clinical smell of peroxide cut through the lingering scent of smoke in her nose. She poured a generous splash onto the rag and brought it to her eyebrow. The sting was immediate and blinding. Maeve hissed through her teeth, her eyes watering instantly. She pulled the rag away, gasping. Roman stopped dabbing his own face. He watched her struggle, his dark eyes tracking the fresh tear leaking down her cheek. Without a word, he reached across the island. Maeve flinched backward, her shoulders hitting the edge of the counter. "Relax," he growled softly. He took the damp rag from her trembling fingers. "You're going to give yourself a scar rubbing it like that." He leaned closer. He smelled intensely of sweat rain and the sharp bite of the alcohol. His large, rough hand caught her chin, holding her steady. His grip was firm, inescapable but surprisingly careful. "Close your eyes," he ordered. She did. The darkness made her hyper-aware of his proximity. She felt the cool, damp cloth press against her brow bone. He moved with practiced, efficient strokes, wiping away the dirt and blood without pressing directly into the laceration. The pain ebbed to a dull, throbbing ache. "Someone knew my schedule," Roman murmured, his thumb brushing lightly against her jaw as he adjusted her face to the light. He wasn't really talking to her. He was thinking out loud, his mind a million miles away, calculating angles and betrayals. "Someone knew I'd be at that diner. Only 3 people knew that." Maeve kept her eyes shut tight. "Are you going to kill them?" His hand paused. The silence stretched heavy and thick. "Yes," Roman said simply. There was no boastfulness, just a bleak logistical fact. He pulled the rag away and dropped it onto the counter. "Done. Open your eyes." She opened them. He was already pulling away, the brief moment of care evaporating into the cold reality of the room. He reached into his pocket and placed a cheap black plastic burner phone on the granite. "Dial this number," Roman said, sliding a slip of paper next to the phone. "It connects to a switchboard that will route to your mother's landline. Untraceable." Maeve snatched the phone, her heart leaping into her throat. "Tell her," Roman continued, his tone hardening, "that you got a last-minute opportunity to cater a wealthy client's wedding out of state. It pays triple your usual rate. Tell her you'll wire her money tomorrow for her medication. Tell her anything She needs to hear, so she stays in that apartment and locks the deadbolt. If she goes looking for you, my enemies will find her before I can." Maeve stared at the plastic device. The lie felt heavy and foul on her tongue before she even spoke it. She looked at Roman, hating the absolute terrifying logic in his eyes. She punched in the numbers. Sleep felt like a mugging. Maeve woke, violently gasping for air, her hands clawing at the high thread count sheets. For 3 terrifying seconds, she thought she was back in the alley. The roar of the explosion echoed in her skull. Then her eyes adjusted to the dim grey light filtering through the automated blackout blinds. She was in the guest bedroom of the safe house. The mattress was memory foam, swallowing her body in a way that felt entirely unnatural after years of sleeping on a cheap, sagging spring bed. She sat up, rubbing her face. Her eyebrow throbbed rhythmically with her heartbeat. Her mouth tasted like old copper. Muffled voices drifted through the heavy oak door. Maeve froze. The safe house had been empty last night. She slid out of bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor. She crept toward the door, pressing her ear against the cool wood. Found the wiring harness 2 blocks away in a dumpster. Professional job. Military-grade detonator. The voice was raspy, thick with a Brooklyn accent. "Who?" Roman's voice. Cold, flat, unyielding. "Declan is shaking down the mechanics on the east side," a second smoother voice replied. "But Elias thinks it was an inside job. The Lincoln was parked in the secure garage until 30 minutes before you left." Maeve swallowed hard. She slowly turned the brass doorknob. It opened with barely a whisper. She peeked through the narrow crack. The living room was transformed. The sterile emptiness was now occupied by 2 men who looked like they breathed violence. One pacing near the window was tall and wiry, wearing a tailored suit that didn't quite hide the bulge under his arm. The other sat on the pristine white sofa, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. He was built like a cinder block, with a thick neck and a nose that had been broken multiple times. Roman sat in an armchair drinking black coffee from a bone china cup. He looked worse than last night. Purple shadows bruised the skin under his eyes. He hadn't slept. "Elias is right," Roman said, taking a slow sip. "It's someone inside, someone on the payroll. What do you want us to do when we find him, boss?" the wiry man asked, stopping his pacing. Roman lowered the cup. The ceramic clinked softly against the saucer. "Don't kill him, not right away. Bring him to the warehouse by the docks. I want to know exactly how much they paid him to betray me. I want his fingernails pulled off one by one until he gives me a name." Bile surged up Maeve's throat, hot and acidic. She clapped a hand over her mouth, stumbling backward. Her heel caught the edge of a Persian rug. She slipped her knee, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, hollow thud. Silence instantly fell over the living room. "Check the hall," Roman commanded, his voice dropping an octave. Panic seized Maeve. She scrambled to her feet, but it was too late. The door swung open fully. The wiry man stood there, his hand resting casually on the butt of a pistol holstered at his hip. He looked down at her, his eyes dead and unreadable. "Well," the man said, looking back over his shoulder. "The waitress is awake." Roman stood up from his armchair. He walked slowly toward the hallway, his face an impenetrable mask. He stopped beside his lieutenant, looking down at Maeve, who was pressed against the wall, clutching the oversized black t-shirt to her chest. "Wait in the kitchen, Carter," Roman said without looking away from Maeve. "You too, Hayes." "Boss, you sure?" the cinderblock man asked from the sofa. She heard everything. Roman finally snapped his gaze toward the man. It was a look of pure, concentrated venom. "Did I stutter?" The 2 men exchanged a brief look before nodding deferentially. They shuffled past Maeve, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, and disappeared into the kitchen. Roman stepped into the hallway and pulled the bedroom door shut behind him, enclosing the two of them in the dim, narrow space. "You shouldn't eavesdrop," he said quietly. "You're going to torture someone." Maeve whispered, her voice shaking violently. She couldn't stop looking at his hands, the same hands that had carefully wiped blood from her face last night were going to pull a man apart. Yes. He didn't try to soften it. He didn't offer a justification. "You're a monster." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Roman let out a slow, heavy breath. He leaned his shoulder against the wall, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked tired, deeply, fundamentally exhausted. "What did you think this was?" he asked, his tone devoid of anger. "Did you think I was just a misunderstood guy in a nice suit? I run a criminal syndicate? People try to kill me. If I don't respond with overwhelming brutality, they will try again. Next time, it won't be a bomb under my car. It will be a bullet in the head of a girl who just happened to be washing a window." Maeve flinched. "I didn't ask you to run out into that rain," Roman continued, stepping closer. He invaded her personal space, forcing her to look up into his dark, storm-grey eyes. "You made a choice. You saved my life. And in my world, no good deed goes unpunished. You are tied to me now. So you can cry, you can call me a monster, you can hate me all you want. But do not forget that my monstrousness is the only reason you and your mother are going to survive the week." He held her gaze for a long, agonizing second before pushing past her, heading toward the kitchen. "There's oatmeal in the pantry," he threw over his shoulder. "Eat something. You look like a ghost." The silence in the penthouse stretched thick and suffocating long after the heavy oak door clicked shut behind Roman's two lieutenants. They had left an hour later, taking the stench of impending violence with them. Maeve sat at the vast granite kitchen island, staring down at a bowl of lukewarm, instant oatmeal she had no memory of making. The spoon felt heavy in her hand. Her mind was a chaotic loop of the morning's events, the casual discussion of pulling fingernails, the cold, dead certainty in Roman's eyes. She had grown up in a bad neighborhood. She had seen drug deals, street fights, and the occasional flashing lights of a crime scene tape. But poverty crime was desperate, chaotic. This was something else. This was industrialized violence. Cold, calculated, and corporate. Footsteps approached from the hallway. Roman emerged, having changed into a fresh, slate-grey button-down and dark slacks. The cut on his cheek was sealed with a sterile butterfly bandage. He looked put-together professional. It made her stomach churn even more. He walked to the coffee machine, pressing a button. The machine whirred, grinding expensive beans. "Did she believe you?" Roman asked, his back to her. Maeve blinked, snapping out of her trance. "Who?" "Your mother, when you called her last night." Maeve looked down at her oatmeal. A fresh wave of guilt washed over her, heavy and sour. "I think so." She was confused. "I've never catered a day in my life. But she worries about money more than she worries about me. I told her I was getting paid $3,000. She stopped asking questions after that." Roman turned around, leaning against the counter, a steaming mug of espresso in his hand. He watched her intently. He wasn't glaring anymore. He was studying her, analyzing the way her shoulders hunched inward, the way she refused to meet his eyes. "Lying to family is the hardest part," he said quietly. Maeve finally looked up, a bitter scoff escaping her lips. "I doubt you have a hard time lying to anyone." Roman didn't take the bait. He took a sip of his coffee. "I lied to my father every day for 10 years, told him I was going to legitimize the business, told him we were transitioning to real estate. He died believing his son was a clean man." Maeve frowned, genuinely surprised by the admission. "Why tell me that?" Because you're sitting there vibrating with guilt, Roman replied, setting his mug down. You think you've committed an unforgivable sin by lying to a sick woman to keep her safe. You haven't. You did what was necessary. Guilt is a useless emotion in survival. I don't want to just survive. Maeve snapped, her frustration finally boiling over. She pushed the bowl of oatmeal away. It clattered loudly against the granite. I want my life back. I want to go to my miserable underpaying job and smell like fry grease and complain about my back aching. I don't want to hide in a glass tower while men map out tortures in the next room. Roman's expression hardened. He pushed off the counter, walking slowly around the island until he was standing directly beside her stool. Maeve tensed, fully expecting him to grab her, to yell, to assert dominance. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills bound by a paper band. He dropped it onto the counter in front of her. $10,000, Roman said flatly. Maeve stared at the money. It was more cash than she had seen in her entire life. It looked dirty somehow, like it was soaked in invisible blood. What is this? She whispered. Hazard pay, Roman said. You're off the clock as a waitress. You're on my clock now. That pays for your mother's dialysis for the next 6 months. It pays her rent. It pays for her groceries. Maeve's breath hitched. She wanted to push the money back. She wanted to spit in his face and tell him she couldn't be bought. But the crushing weight of her mother's past-due medical bills flashed in her mind. The collection notices taped to their apartment door. The look of pure terror in her mother's eyes when the pharmacy said they couldn't front the insulin again. Her hand trembled as she reached out her fingertips, brushing the crisp paper edge of the bills. She hated herself in that moment. She hated the profound relief that washed over her, drowning out her principles. Why? Maeve asked, her voice cracking. I saved you. We're even. You don't owe me this. Roman looked down at her. His eyes flicked to the bandage on her forehead, then to her bruised, soot-stained knuckles, gripping the cash. You didn't flinch, Roman said softly, almost to himself. When the car blew, when I pinned you to the wall. You were terrified, but you didn't break. I don't owe you anything, Maeve. But I recognize grit when I see it. He turned away, walking back toward the hallway. Get some sleep. Tonight we move. This safe house is only secure for 48 hours. Maeve sat alone in the massive, silent kitchen, clutching the stack of blood money to her chest, realizing with horrifying clarity that she was no longer a bystander. She was in the game. The city at 3 a.m. was a corpse, stripped of its daytime flesh, and left as nothing but concrete bones and flickering sodium vapor arteries. Maeve sat in the back of a matte black armored SUV, her knees pressed together. The heavy steel doors had closed with a vacuum-sealed thud, locking the outside world away. The interior smelled fiercely of gun oil, stale black coffee, and the sharp chemical scent of industrial air freshener, masking something older and fouler underneath. Roman sat in the front passenger seat. He hadn't spoken since they left the penthouse via the freight elevator. The driver, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett, navigated the wet, potholed streets of the industrial district, with the headlights cut, relying only on the ambient amber glow of the street lamps. In her lap, Maeve clutched a cheap canvas duffel bag. Inside it, wrapped in her discarded, soot-stained waitress uniform, was the $10,000. The bag felt impossibly heavy. It anchored her to the seat, a physical manifestation of her complicity. She rubbed her thumb over the rough canvas strap until the friction burned her skin. "We're 3 blocks out," Garrett murmured. His voice was a gravelly rumble over the hum of the heavy tires. Roman nodded once. He reached into his coat, pulling out a heavy, blocky, semi-automatic pistol. The metallic clack-clack of him racking the slide was the loudest sound in the car. It made the hair on the back of Maeve's neck stand up. He checked the chamber, his movements practiced, fluid, and utterly devoid of emotion. He was checking his keys before leaving the house. "Stay low," Roman said, not looking back at her. "When the door opens, you move straight into the loading bay. Don't stop to look around. Don't ask questions." Maeve swallowed the dry, acidic taste in her mouth. "Okay." The SUV took a sharp, aggressive turn, tires hissing violently against standing water. They plunged down a steep concrete ramp, the darkness absolute, for 3 agonizing seconds before Garrett hit a garage remote. A massive, rusted, corrugated metal door ground upward on unoiled tracks, screaming a metallic protest into the dead night. They rolled into a cavernous, subterranean space. It smelled of old, stagnant water, mildew, and rotting cardboard. The engine cut off. The silence that rushed in was heavy, oppressive, and thick with tension. "Go," Roman ordered. Maeve fumbled with the heavy door handle. It took 2 violent shoves to break the hermetic seal. She practically fell out of the vehicle, her sneakers hitting slick, oil-stained concrete. The air down here was 10 degrees colder than the street level. It bit through her oversized black t-shirt, raising goosebumps on her arms. Garrett was already moving, his hand resting on the holster at his hip, his head on a swivel. Roman stepped out, his posture completely shifted. The stiff-tailored businessman from the penthouse was gone. This man was a predator, prowling familiar, dangerous territory. "Up the stairs!" Roman pointed to a rust-flaked iron staircase bolted to the far cinder-block wall. Maeve practically ran. She didn't want to be left behind in the dark. Her breath hitched in her throat, a tight, painful rhythm. She gripped the icy iron railing, the rust leaving a gritty metallic residue on her palms. At the top of the stairs, Garrett punched a code into a heavy steel door. It clicked loudly. They filed into what used to be a foreman's office, overlooking a defunct textile floor. The space was brutal. Cinder-block walls, a single battered metal desk, and folding chairs. The windows looking out over the factory floor were thick, reinforced glass, caked with decades of industrial grime. A single bare bulb hung from a frayed wire in the center of the room, casting harsh, swinging shadows. "Secure the perimeter," Roman told Garrett. Garrett nodded and slipped back out the door. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a final echoing thwack. Maeve stood in the center of the room, hugging the duffel bag to her chest. She looked at the peeling grey paint, the water stains blooming on the acoustic tile ceiling. It felt like a bunker. It felt like a tomb. Roman didn't look at her. He walked to the reinforced window, staring out into the pitch-black abyss of the factory floor below. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, tapped one against his thumb, and lit it with a cheap plastic lighter. The sharp scratch of the flint sparked in the dim room. The acrid smell of cheap tobacco filled the small office, covering the scent of mildew. He exhaled a long, thin stream of grey smoke against the glass. "You don't strike me as a smoker," Maeve said. Her voice sounded thin, trembling slightly in the cold air. "I'm not," Roman replied, his voice rough. He took another drag, the cherry burning a bright, angry orange in the gloom. "I only smoke when I'm deciding how to kill someone." Maeve flinched. The bluntness of it hit her like a physical blow. She walked over to one of the folding chairs and sat down heavily, dropping the duffel bag between her feet. She wrapped her arms around her torso, shivering uncontrollably. "Carter called while you were asleep." Roman continued, his back still turned to her. He watched the smoke curl and die against the cold glass. He finished at the docks. He got a name out of the mechanic who rigged the Lincoln. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to know. She wanted to unhear the conversation from the penthouse. She wanted to erase the image of pulling fingernails from her brain. "Who was it?" she asked anyway. The morbid curiosity of survival. Roman turned slowly. The overhead bulb caught the sharp angles of his face, illuminating the bandage on his cheek and the absolute, terrifying deadness in his eyes. He looked hollowed out, a shell of a man running purely on vengeance. "Leo," Roman said softly. "My father's brother, the man who taught me how to shoot, the man who sat at my dining room table last Thanksgiving." Maeve's breath caught. She looked at his hands. They were perfectly steady. The cigarette didn't even tremble, but the muscle in his jaw was ticking a rapid, involuntary spasm. "Your uncle," she whispered. "Blood means nothing in this life." Maeve laughed. Roman stated, tossing the half-smoked cigarette onto the concrete floor and crushing it under the heel of his Italian leather shoe. "It just means they know exactly where to slip the knife." 2 hours crawled by, agonizing and cold. Maeve sat on the folding chair, her knees pulled up to her chest, her chin resting on her forearms. She watched Roman. He hadn't stopped moving. He paced the length of the small office, a caged animal driven entirely by dark, violent energy. He had made 4 brief coded phone calls on burner phones, destroying each plastic handset immediately after hanging up, snapping them in half and tossing the pieces into a rusted metal trash can. The air in the room was thick with the smell of ozone-burnt plastic and his lingering tobacco smoke. "They're bringing him here," Roman finally announced, stopping his pacing. He leaned against the metal desk, crossing his arms. Maeve's head snapped up. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through her nervous system. "Here now." "In 10 minutes." "No." Maeve stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the concrete. Her hands were shaking again. "No, you can't do that here. I'm here. You said I was just waiting until the heat died down. You didn't say I had to sit in the next room while you... She couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what was about to happen, the sounds she would hear, the blood that would inevitably spill onto the concrete outside this office, made her stomach violently reject itself. She dry-heaved, clapping a hand over her mouth, tasting bile. Roman watched her with clinical detachment. "You're not going anywhere, Maeve. The streets are exposed. Leo's men are looking for me, and by extension they are looking for you. You are safer in this room than anywhere else in the city." "Safe?" She spat tears of pure frustration burning her eyes. "You think I feel safe with you? You're going to execute your own uncle on the other side of that glass. You're a psychopath." He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her, but he crowded her, his physical presence overwhelming, backing her up, until her shoulder blades hit the icy cinder block wall. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness." Roman growled his voice, a low, vibrating threat that rattled her teeth. He smelled of sweat and adrenaline, now the raw scent of a predator preparing for a kill. "Leo put a bomb under my car. He knew my driver, a kid with a pregnant wife, was in the front seat. He didn't care. He tried to turn my neighborhood into a crater to take my chair. So yes, I am going to put a bullet in his head. And you are going to sit in that chair, and you are going to keep your mouth shut, because if you run out that door, you won't make it to the end of the block." Maeve stared up at him, her chest heaving. She saw the monster. It wasn't hidden anymore. It was right on the surface, staring back at her with flat, grey eyes. But beneath it, buried deep under layers of sociopathic conditioning and mafia bravado, she saw something else. A flicker of profound, suffocating betrayal. A boy who had been sold out by his own blood. "You don't have to do it," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was a stupid, naive thing to say, but she couldn't stop herself. The waitress from the diner, the girl who believed in rules and decency, was dying a hard death, but she wasn't entirely gone yet. Roman's expression faltered for a fraction of a second. A muscle twitched in his cheek. He looked at her mouth, then up to her eyes. his gaze heavy and complicated. "Yes," he said softly, the anger draining out of his voice, leaving only bleak resignation. "I do." He stepped back, breaking the proximity. The heavy steel door clicked and groaned open. Carter stood in the doorway. His suit was rumpled, his knuckles bruised purple and swelling. He looked tired, but his eyes were wired tight. "He's in the basement," Carter reported, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Garrett has him zip-tied to a load-bearing pillar." Roman didn't hesitate. He didn't look back at Maeve. He reached into his coat, his hand wrapping around the grip of the pistol, and walked out the door. Carter lingered for a second. He looked at Maeve, huddled against the wall, pale and shaking. He offered no sympathy. He just grabbed the heavy steel door and pulled it shut. The deadbolt slammed into place. Maeve was alone. The silence in the office was deafening. It pressed against her eardrums a heavy physical weight. She walked mechanically to the reinforced glass window. She couldn't see the basement from here, only the vast, empty factory floor below, littered with rusted machinery and rotting wooden pallets. She pressed her forehead against the cold, filthy glass. She closed her eyes and clamped her hands over her ears, pressing hard enough to cause pain. She hummed a stupid pop song from the diner's jukebox, trying to drown out the world. She waited for the gunshot. She waited for 5 minutes, then 10. Her arms began to ache. The tension in her shoulders was sharp enough to slice through bone. Bang! It was muffled by the concrete floors, but it vibrated through the soles of her shoes. A single heavy percussion. Maeve gasped, dropping her hands from her ears. She stumbled backward, tripping over the leg of the folding chair and falling hard onto her backside. The concrete bruised her tailbone. She scrambled backward like a crab until she hit the desk, pulling her knees tight against her chest, rocking slightly. It was done. He had killed his own family. She sat there in the dim light, the smell of burnt plastic and stale tobacco nauseating her. The $10,000 in the bag beside her felt like toxic waste. Suddenly, the heavy steel door didn't just unlock. It exploded inward. The metallic shriek of the hinges giving way was terrifying. The door slammed against the cinder-block wall, kicking up a cloud of grey dust. Maeve screamed, throwing her arms over her head. It wasn't Roman. 3 men poured into the room. They weren't wearing tailored suits. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy boots, and ski masks. They smelled of wet, rain-damp wool and the harsh metallic tang of cordite. One of them spotted her huddled beneath the desk. He raised a short, brutal-looking assault rifle, pointing the black muzzle directly at her face. "Don't move, bitch!" he barked, his voice muffled by the mask. Maeve froze, her brain completely short-circuited. The world narrowed down to the black circle of the barrel. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't blink. "Where is Rossi?" the man demanded, stepping closer, the heavy treads of his boots crunching against the grit on the floor. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached down, grabbing a fistful of her oversized black t-shirt, and hauled her violently to her feet. Maeve choked the collar, digging into her windpipe. Her feet dangled for a second before she scrambled to find the floor. "I don't know," she shrieked, panic finally overwhelming paralysis. "I don't know. Check the floor," the man holding her yelled to the other 2. "He's in the building." The 2 men rushed toward the window, peering down into the darkness. Before they could turn back, the glass shattered. It wasn't a bullet. It was a deafening, concussive boom from the factory floor below that blew the reinforced glass inward. A wave of heat and pulverized dust hit the office. The man holding Maeve stumbled his grip, loosening slightly. That was all the opening she needed. Pure animal desperation took over. She didn't think. She just reacted. She brought her knee up with every ounce of strength she had, driving it directly into the man's groin. He let out a wet, breathless grunt and doubled over, dropping his rifle. The heavy weapon clattered loudly onto the concrete. Maeve didn't wait to see him fall. She spun around her foot, catching the strap of her canvas duffel bag. She grabbed it purely on instinct, hoisting it over her shoulder, and scrambled through the open doorway, plunging blindly into the dark, rusted stairwell. The stairwell was a vertical tunnel of pitch black and echoing chaos. Maeve tumbled down the iron steps, her feet barely finding purchase. The rusted railing tore at the skin of her palms, leaving wet, bleeding scrapes she didn't even feel through the adrenaline. Below her, the factory floor was lit up by erratic, strobing flashes of gunfire. Crack, crack, crack. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, bouncing off the concrete walls and drilling into her skull. It smelled like fireworks and pulverized stone. "She's on the stairs!" A voice roared from above. Heavy boots hit the iron grating, descending fast. Maeve hit the landing. The heavy duffel bag swung wildly, slamming into her hip, throwing her off balance. She pitched forward, scraping her knees hard against the rough concrete floor. A sharp, hot pain sliced through her leg, but she couldn't stop. She scrambled on all fours behind a massive, rusted industrial loom, pressing her back against the cold, greasy metal. She pulled her knees tight to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Her heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was going to crack her ribs. She clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle her ragged, gasping breaths. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating her tongue and making her want to cough. She swallowed it down, tears streaming down her face, cutting clean tracks through the soot. Footsteps crunched cautiously on the debris, not 10 feet from her hiding spot. A flashlight beam swept across the floor, the bright white circle cutting through the thick, swirling dust. The beam hit the edge of the loom, casting long, jumping shadows over Maeve's legs. She squeezed her eyes shut. This is it. Suddenly, a massive, dark shape materialized from the shadows behind the man with the flashlight. There was no warning shout, just the sickening, wet sound of a heavy blade finding soft tissue. The man grunted a short, surprised sound and collapsed forward, the flashlight clattering across the floor, spinning wildly until the beam settled on a pile of rotting pallets. Roman stood over the body. He was a nightmare. His pristine slate-grey shirt was torn at the shoulder, soaked in a dark, spreading stain of his own blood. His face was a mask of pure primal violence, coated in concrete dust and red splatter. He held a combat knife in one hand, the blade dripping black in the dim light. In his other hand, his pistol was gripped so tightly his knuckles were bone white. He looked around his chest, heaving his eyes wild. "Maeve!" He hissed, his voice hoarse. She couldn't speak. She uncurled her legs and dragged herself out from behind the loom, keeping low to the ground. Roman saw her. The wild, feral look in his eyes dimmed for a microsecond. He stepped over the body, moving toward her with alarming speed. He grabbed her arm, his grip slick with blood, and hauled her to her feet. "We have to move," he growled. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He didn't check her for bullet holes. "Where's Garrett?" she stammered, stumbling as he pulled her forward. "Dead," Roman spat. "Carter, too. Leo set a trap. He knew I'd bring him here." The reality hit her like a bucket of ice water. The invincible mafia boss had been outplayed. His men were dead. He was bleeding heavily, leaving a dark trail on the concrete. They were alone. More shouting echoed from the far side of the factory floor. Flashlights began to cut through the dust, sweeping in grid patterns. Roman shoved her behind a stack of steel shipping crates. He leaned heavily against the metal, his breathing ragged. He pressed his hand against his torn shoulder. Blood seeped through his fingers, thick and dark. Maeve stared at his wound. The sight of it, the sheer volume of blood, broke through her panic. "You're shot," she whispered. Grazed, he gritted out, though the pallor of his face suggested otherwise. He popped the magazine out of his pistol, checked it, and slammed it back in. 3 rounds left. "There's a maintenance tunnel," Roman said, his voice straining. 50 yards east. It leads to the storm drains. When I start shooting, you run. You don't look back." Maeve looked at him. Really looked at him. He was willing to die right here to give a waitress he met 24 hours ago a chance to escape. It wasn't noble. It was a cold, calculated transaction. He had dragged her into this. He was balancing the ledger. "No," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. Roman glared at her, his eyes flashing with sudden violent anger. "This isn't a negotiation. Run. You have 3 bullets and you're bleeding out," Maeve hissed back, her own anger flaring a desperate cornered animal rage. "You won't last 10 seconds, and I don't know where the hell a storm drain is." She dropped her canvas bag. She ripped off the oversized black t-shirt she was wearing over her tank top. The cold air hit her skin, but she didn't care. She bundled the fabric up, ignoring the blood and dirt, and pressed it hard against Roman's bleeding shoulder. He hissed in pain, his body tensing aggressively. His free hand shot up, grabbing her wrist with crushing force. "What are you doing?" he snarled. "Applying pressure, you idiot!" she snapped, pushing her body weight into the makeshift bandage. "My mother has diabetic ulcers. I know how to stop bleeding." Roman stared at her, genuinely stunned. The waitress was yelling at him. She was bleeding from her knees, her face smeared with dirt, her eyes wide with terror, but she was pressing a dirty shirt into his bullet wound with absolute defiance. A flashlight beam swept inches from their crate. Heavy boots approached. "Over here!" a voice yelled. Roman's eyes locked onto Maeve's. In that fraction of a second, in the dark smelling of blood and cordite, a silent understanding passed between them. The rigid lines of their worlds had shattered. There was no mafia boss and innocent bystander anymore. There were only 2 people trying to survive the next 10 seconds. Roman shifted his grip. He let go of her wrist and grabbed the back of her neck, his large, blood-slick hand pulling her down as he ducked low. "Keep your head down," he whispered, his lips grazing her ear. He swung around the edge of the crate, raising the pistol. Crack! Crack! 2 shots, 2 heavy thuds. He didn't wait to check the bodies. He grabbed the strap of her duffel bag, threw it over his good shoulder, and grabbed her hand. "Run!" They sprinted into the darkness, leaving the sterile world behind, plunging deep into the brutal, bleeding heart of the underground. Conclusion. Did Maeve make the biggest mistake of her life by warning the mafia boss, or was it the only way to escape her mundane reality? The underworld is a dangerous place, and Roman and Maeve's survival is far from guaranteed. If you felt the tension, the grit and the raw emotion of this story, hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves dark romance and high-stakes mafia drama. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next pulse-pounding chapter of Roman and Maeve's twisted journey. What do you think Roman will do next? Let me know in the comments.